part of the furniture now. So been president and now vice president for a long time, and yeah, obviously pretty active on kind of birding, as many of you know. Works for BirdLife Australia, is on the media all the time. So yeah, some introduction, but I'll pass you over to Mick.
Thanks for the invitation to talk. Actually, no, myself. I couldn't find anyone for May, so stuck with me. And do suffer a little bit from dyslexia. So the original title was Mistletoe Bird, Robin Hood of the Bird World, but it's kind of morphed back to the original title, which is Mistletoe, Robin Hood of the Plant World. I just thought I'd reel in all the birdos with the mistletoe bird reference. So this is a talk that we've given a few times now. It kind of changes each time we give it, but it's become a little bit of an obsession, I guess. Mistletoe is a really fascinating plant, as you'll hopefully find out. Yeah. So first of all, I'm going to bust some myths. Mistletoe's got a pretty bad reputation, so I want to try and change a few perceptions there. How is it Robin Hood? Why is it important for endangered birds? And then I'll finish talking about a mistletoe planting project that we're working on. So myth number one, some people tend to think that mistletoes are weeds and they're not native to Australia. And that, I guess, stems from the perception of mistletoe being associated with Christmas and kissing under the mistletoe and all that sort of stuff. It couldn't be further from the truth. That folklore Christmas reference comes from Europe's only mistletoe. They have one and we have 97. Mind you, it could be 98 or 99 now because there are new species being described. In fact, Australia has more native species of mistletoe than any other country. And it was always widely used by Indigenous people for food. And snotty gobble was one of the terms used and I do recommend it. It's actually pretty tasty. The needle leaf one is better than the other. So that's our first myth busted. Definitely native to Australia. But this is the big one. This is the one that we're really trying to work on. There is a definite perception out there that mistletoe kills trees. It's possible, and Dr. David Watson, whose name I might mention a few times, Mr. Mistletoe, he's written the book, he uses the analogy that mistletoes kill trees about as often as a flea or fleas kill a dog. It just happens very rarely, and it's one hell of a sick dog or a sick tree if it happens. Think about it. If you're a flea, you don't want the dog to die. Just like a mistletoe, you don't want the plant that you're growing on to die. If that happened, mistletoes would have disappeared from evolution a very long time ago. The host trees do have some defense mechanisms, such as dropping branches and things like that. They don't necessarily always like having a mistletoe growing. But if you see a tree succumbing to mistletoe infestation, there's nearly always other things at play. Something in the soil, compaction, maybe dieback, salinity, etc. In essence, it's usually only stressed paddock trees. If you go into the bush, you'll rarely see a tree that has succumbed to mistletoe. I mean, you can see there, that poor tree is dealing with a lot. And as the mistletoe sort of proliferates, because mistletoe birds are coming in and dropping more seeds, presumably, then trees like that will succumb to mistletoe. But generally speaking, it doesn't happen. So that's the really important myth busted. And a lot of people think that they should be removed from trees. They're often referred to as tree cancer, which is just so unfortunate. But just leave them. Really, in a bush environment, they're just another plant. And like I said before, you rarely see trees succumb into mistletoe in a bush environment. And they're not poisonous. That's another common misconception. When mistletoe plants fall to the ground, cows and sheep and other things will quite happily graze on the foliage. They're not poisonous. That's that myth busted. But this is a point that I'm going to expand on now, is the benefits, the ecological benefits of having mistletoe in an environment. I'm calling them the superheroes of the plant world. They're amazing things. They're amazing because they provide fruit year round. So the leaves are browsed upon by possums, gliders, even koalas are known to eat mistletoe foliage. Then when the plant flowers, a lot of birds come in for the nectar. Then after the flowers are spent, the fruits form, then there's some tasty berries. So there's always a food source coming out of the mistletoe clump. The high water content makes them quite weighty, and eventually a branch might drop, which actually promotes hollow formation in trees. And they are also a great place to hang out in the heat of a day. There's a booble cow taking a rest in the shade in a large mistletoe in Western Australia. And that's courtesy of Dave Watson. So it's a structure as well as the plant itself. So I guess this is where the Robin Hood reference comes in, because it's a plant that robs from the rich. It takes all its nutrients from its host plant, and it doesn't take a lot. And then it produces photosynthesis. It produces its own energy through photosynthesis. Connected to the trees by an organ called a haustorium, which is that woody sort of section you can see there. And yeah, so they can produce fruit and flowers at any time of year, even when conditions are quite harsh. And they only take what they need. They don't actually create a huge amount of stress for the host tree, which I guess is a bit of a Robin Hood thing. You don't want to take too much. And they give back to the poor through food, shelter, and nutrient-rich leaf litter. So the leaf litter aspect of mistletoes is actually really fascinating. And I'll talk about an experiment that David Watson did a few years ago, where he actually removed mistletoe from a landscape, and the results were quite surprising. So the litter, so apart from creating habitat while they're up in the tree, they're also creating habitat when they're on the ground. When things like gum trees drop their leaves, the leaves are generally dry, so it's quite a dry leaf litter on the floor, whereas with mistletoe, the leaves always drop while they're still quite succulent. So it's almost like a humus layer, like you see in a rainforest. Many Australian butterflies lay their eggs in mistletoe on the leaves, and some butterflies do that nowhere else. And of course, Australian birds feed on the fruit and the flowers. And they're also a great nesting site. I don't know if you spotted the olive-backed oriole sitting in there. 245 different birds have been recorded nesting in mistletoe. 3/4 of all birds in Australia that nest in trees have been recorded nesting in mistletoe. Probably, yeah, or hollow. Yeah. So there we go. Robin Hood. So it's so important that it's said to be a keystone resource. So a keystone, the concept of keystone is that you remove that, the whole system collapses. And this brings me to the experiment that David Watson did down near Albury over 3 years across a very large area. And I'll just toggle through those. You can see the photo on the right. Took a long time, but he got all these cherry pickers out, and they removed mistletoe from an environment, and it was all, it was a well-controlled scientific experiment. And so I guess first up, about 1/3 of all bird species disappeared. They just completely were nowhere to be seen from the areas where the mistletoe was removed. But the surprising result that not even Dave expected was it was the ground foraging insectivores that showed the greatest decline, not the birds. You'd think that when you remove mistletoe, you're taking the food away from the nectar sippers and the berry eaters, but it was the birds on the ground. Yeah, no, absolutely, for sure. Yeah, you end up with more potassium, at the base of a tree when there's mistletoe. So they do actually give back. Yeah. But what he found was, because he then obviously good scientist, you know, he sort of looked at what was going on the ground and found that this incredible diversity of litter-dwelling arthropods, spiders and beetles and moth larvae and things like that, which is basically bird food. So, yeah, I've just thrown some photos in there of all three of those birds are feeding chicks, and they're feeding them spiders, and they've probably got those spiders off the ground. So mistletoe gone, leaf litter gone, too dry, you know, all these ground dwelling insects and arthropods disappeared. So really interesting that, yeah, something in a tree, when you take it out, it's the birds on the ground. And to be fair, because I work in woodland bird conservation, it's really the ground foraging birds are really the iconic group in woodland birds, or your robins and diamond firetails, turquoise parrots, all those things. You know, there are lots of different types of woodland birds, but the ground foragers are really the iconic group. So just going to now talk about nectar feeding birds. So there's about 80 species of honeyeaters in Australia, plus a few parrots, lorikeets and swifties. Most of these birds seek out gum tree blossom, or they'll go to banksias, grevilleas, aromophilus, things like that. And of course, these birds play a very important role in pollination. But when those plants don't flower, which happens quite often, you know, you can go a long time between certain gum trees flowering, these nectar feeding birds turn to mistletoe. All four of those photos were taken from the same place. That was the Melbourne woodlands, surprise, surprise, from the same spot. They were all feeding on the long flowered mistletoe. And that's some birds getting into the box mistletoe, musk lorikeet, brown-headed honeyeater at the bottom, and a noisy frybird. Grey mistletoe. Took those three photos just a couple of weeks ago, up where the regents were found. And I was really amazed to see noisy miners getting really stuck into the grey mistletoe. And they were, noisy miners are aggressive, and I actually come across noisy miners a lot in my work, but I've never seen noisy miners defending a food source as much as those birds were defending this mistletoe. It was actually absolutely amazing. And then, you know, and of course, when the fruit appears, you know, things you wouldn't expect. Musk lorikeet eating mistletoe fruit, and red-winged parrot. All of these photos are taken in the Hunter too. So Robin Hood had his merry men. So the merry men of mistletoe world are the dispersed. So of course the mistletoe bird is best known. It specialises in eating mistletoe fruit. It even got named after it. And of course, painted honeyeater is the other one. But there's a number of other honeyeaters that are very fond of mistletoe. In fact, I'm pretty certain that the only reason there are singing honeyeaters and actually lots of spiny cheeks in the Hunter Valley, I reckon the only reason there are lots of spiny cheek honeyeaters in the Hunter Valley is because of the amount of mistletoe we have, particularly the grey mistletoe. But all these other opportunists and silver eyes and things will have a go at the fruit. So the mistletoe bird, yeah, inextricably linked to mistletoe, of course. So one of the fascinating things about the mistletoe bird is that it's lacking an organ in its digestive system. It doesn't have a gizzard. So when a mistletoe bird eats mistletoe fruit, it's only actually inside the digestive tract for 20 minutes on average. It's just in and out. So it's a very, very rapid process. So it doesn't really get a chance to properly digest. There he is, superhero, Mr. Mistletoe bird. Yeah, and they can crap out a lot of seeds. Okay. The best part of that video, I think, is the seed attaching. So I won't talk too long about the painted honeyeater, except that, because I am going to talk about another endangered bird. But in the hunter, we have two nationally endangered birds that rely on mistletoe. Painted honeyeaters are mostly found west of the Great Dividing Range, except the Hunter Valley, pretty much. The odd bird will turn up in Western Sydney, but the upper Hunter is, to be fair, a stronghold for painted honeyeaters. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that there are a lot of grey mistletoe growing in the upper Hunter. These lines here are botanical divisions, so nothing to do with catchments. These dots up here, that's around Newland, Dirigiries at the top of the Goulburn River catchment, basically. And you can see, there's a lot of painted honeyeater records along that sort of Goulburn River section, and the grey mistletoe explains a lot of that. And the grey mistletoe, is only there because its host trees are there, which are particular wattles. So I'm going to talk about. Did you really think you could get away with? Because it would lead into it's pretty interesting how in my opinion, I think mistletoe has actually seen the Regent Honeyeater through a major bottleneck. So I'm pretty confident everybody knows all about the Regent Honeyeater. There are as few as 250 to 300 birds left, critically endangered at every level. And so the bird now breeds in very few places. In fact, in recent years, it's really now down to the peripheral sites around the edge of the Blue Mountains. So Capertee, Burragrang, the upper Hunter around the Goulburn River catchment, and the lower Hunter, basically the Cessnock Forest, or you can even narrow that down to the Tamapa woodlands, is where they now breed. And regents also use mistletoe. In fact, Regent Honeyeaters need mistletoe. So that photo on the right there was taken during a breeding event in the Tamapa woodlands back in 2007, which I will talk about. So the regents had a few pretty rough years. 2017 was a pretty good year for them, and they hadn't had a good year until last year. So they were 18, 19 and 20. Those 3 years were very poor breeding seasons for regents. Each of those years we had less than 10 nests found across the entire range of the bird. So in October 2019, George Gillam, a member of the club, was on a property along the Merriwa River, and he reported finding a Regent Honeyeater family. And although that photo is not clear, you can see that's mistletoe blossom. That's the needle leaf mistletoe that grows in the river oaks. So that was one of, you're basically talking about 20% of the breeding sites were in mistletoe that year. In 2020, there were nests along Widden Brook, again in the needle leaf mistletoe. We only had 6 or 7 successful nests across the entire range of the bird that year. I think there were 3 or 4 of those were in mistletoe. The only successful nest that entire season was a pair nesting in mistletoe. Then back at that site that George found the family back in 2019, last year we had 5 nests along this one stretch of the Merriwa River, and all the birds were sustaining themselves on needle leaf mistletoe. Quite remarkable. And there's a photo by Liam. Just love photos like that. And in all cases, this is what the adults were sustaining themselves on. Obviously they were feeding the chicks insects and things, but they were keeping themselves going by feeding on the needle leaf mistletoe. And generally speaking, through those 3 seasons, the gum tree blossom that the regents would normally have relied on didn't flower. So that's why I'm suggesting that really through those 3 seasons, if it wasn't for mistletoe, I just don't know what would or could have happened to the species. And I did mention before the grey mistletoe. A few weeks ago, Gordon Arthur, another member of the club, found and photographed 2 Regent Honeyeaters feeding in grey mistletoe, which is normally the haunt of the painted honeyeater, the spiny cheeks and things like that. It had never been recorded before, ever, of regents feeding in grey mistletoe. Really, really interesting. Yeah, less than a month ago. That was on Flags Road. Where those photos of the striped honeyeater. So we've got 2 nationally threatened honeyeaters that rely on mistletoe locally. So I mentioned that breeding event in 2007 of the regents. That was an enormous breeding event, 25 nests or something, really high nest success rate. And it's touted as being the most significant recruitment of juveniles into the population in modern times. That was in Tamalpin. A few years after that, in 2012, we didn't actually find birds nesting, but we watched them, breeding, but we did watch them building nests, which were subsequently destroyed by frybirds and things, but we're pretty sure that they bred that year. And again, you can see they're on mistletoe. In 2018, Regent Honeyeaters didn't breed anywhere else except Tamalpin, or that we could find them. And there you go. And that photo on the, that you can just make out the eye there. That's a female. That's her beak. She's sitting in a nest in a clump of mistletoe. Unfortunately, that nest was destroyed by a storm. And of course, last year we did the captive release of birds, and we had wild Regent Honeyeaters breeding back in Tamalpin again, feeding in mistletoe. So it's a really important part of this area, and mostly when regents come to Tamalpin to breed, it's the 2 things. It's the mistletoe and the broadleaf ironbark. So, you know, it's a critical resource for a bird that's on the brink of extinction to be able to breed. So that's just a quick map there showing all the Regent Swifty records over the years. I'm not going to talk about Hez, but you could say that the fact that red outline there being an industrial zone land, you would think that's a threat, and trying to turn that around is sort of, that part explains my role in life, trying to get that bushland protected. But I actually feel that fires, intense bushfires, are a bigger threat than the industrial zoning. And we've had 2 really bad fires in those forests in recent years. One in December 2016, and this one in September 2017. The Richmond Vale fire, which a few people in the audience know all about, they basically discovered it. So that map there, quite ironic. It's an overlay of the scars or the fire burnt layers over Regent Honeyeater records. Pretty much 100%. And this area here is where the 2007 main concentration of breeding happened. And these were serious fires. These were fires that happened on 35-degree days with howling northerly winds. But the fires actually travelled through the canopy. Look at that. That's a satellite image. I mean, you can see just how badly burnt that forest was from the December 2016 fire. So the thing about mistletoe, if you go back to those forests now, you'll see that there are some sections that are still pretty bad because they were bad fires, but overall, most of the plants have come back because most Australian plants in this sort of environment resprout after fire. Mistletoe doesn't. When mistletoe is burnt, it's dead. It's all over. So when a canopy fire goes through a forest, there's nothing you can do. Well, there wasn't anything you could do until you basically have to wait for mistletoe birds and other dispersers to come back in and deposit seeds, which obviously would take a very long time. That's just another image there, just showing how, so these are the burnt sections, and a pair built a nest in that. So you can just make out this little section here was unburnt. So the birds are still coming back. But when they come to this section of Tamalpin, so last year the birds were mostly in unburnt areas, but birds are still trying to come back into the burnt areas, and they're just sort of finding these patches that weren't burnt, and more than likely that's because there's mistletoe in those unburnt sections. So it was like, the second fire was the result of a dumped stolen car, which is often the way fires start in these forests. Cars are stolen, dumped, and then set alight. That was that one. The December 2016 fire actually started on the other side of Cessnock Road. It started in Neath, and it was such a bad day that it jumped the main road and then just absolutely motored south, with northerly wind. I think that fire was deliberately lit, but I don't think the person actually said, "Oh, I'm going to burn hares." Like that, yeah, they were burning wherever they were, but it actually jumped the main road. I was on Broughton Island the day of the September 2017 fire, doing some Fields Petrol stuff, I think, and I could see the fire from Broughton. I remember thinking, "Oh God, I hope that's not hares," but it was. Yeah. Anyway, so. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So a lot of the trees, so even if mistletoe birds had flown in and deposited seeds, they probably wouldn't have grown. Yeah, yeah, like early on. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can, yeah. So it can happen in as short a time as 4 or 5 years. I was hoping Peter Vaughan might be here tonight. Peter's a club member. He's also a member of the Australian Plant Society. He's been planting his own mistletoe for many years. But yeah, he was the one that said to me 4 or 5 years. Me and Peter actually planted some out near the National Parks office about 2 years ago or something. I brought my torch with me. I'm going to go and have a look at it if anyone wants to come and have a look, because the last time I checked, it was this big. I'm actually really keen to see. Yeah, but not mistletoe. So we've been planting trees in the Capity Valley for 27 years or something, and those things take a long time. That's a long-term investment. But anyway, regardless, it was like it sort of didn't occur to us until we had a eureka moment, and that was that we could do it ourselves. It was either me or Dean that came up with the idea. I can't remember, but we knew that photo there is taken from a project that David Watson is working with Melbourne City Council on. And so what they're doing in Melbourne is that they're taking mistletoe seeds and planting them in London plane trees. And Tim Flannery has this funny story. He has a standing bet that's still standing, that if anyone could show evidence of insects having eaten plane tree leaves, he'd shout the bar. They are absolutely useless for habitat. I mean, the structure of the tree is the only purpose that a plane tree could serve as habitat. They are they're sterile basically. So the experiment was to plant mistletoe in these useless trees for habitat and see what happens with the bird community in the city of Melbourne. So then we just thought, well, why can't we just do that in the bush? So that's what we've embarked on, and so we're doing it on Wonnarua country, on land owned by Minda River Aboriginal Land Council. It's a collaboration of a number of groups, and I'm really excited to see a few land carers in the audience tonight, because I really think that there's some amazing opportunities to embrace this idea about planting mistletoe in a land care setting, because it happens reasonably quickly and it's quite easy, as as I'll hopefully show you. So what we're doing is, so it's hopefully a large scale planting of seeds into those burnt sections. So I guess, Anthony, this all happened, I guess, 3 or 4 years after the fire, so the trees had recovered. So we're hoping that it'll supercharge the ecosystem again. And as far as we know, this is the first time this type of thing has been attempted. Going into a bushland setting and doing a large scale planting of mistletoe for the purposes of providing habitat for birds. And it's heaps of fun. Kids love it. It's like you go out and you obviously you sort of follow the fruiting of the plants, and when they're that colour, they're ready, and you do the avocado test. You know, when you're at the supermarket, you're all squeezing the avocados. You do that with the mistletoe, and if it's just got that right consistency, they're good to go. And you pick them. I actually made a mistake. You can see this image here. I've picked a lot of these fruits and broken the stalks. A lot of those fruits sort of went bad pretty quick, because if you break the stalk, it starts to oxidize. So you're best off taking the stalk with the fruit, and it'll last longer. And so anyone can walk around, grab a mistletoe fruit and wipe it on a branch, and hopefully it'll grow. But that's of little use to Regent Honeyeater. It's not going to build a nest in a mistletoe that's at your shoulder height. So we needed to engage professional arborists to get the seeds up into the canopy. And I reckon this is really cool footage. Like, these guys just make it look so easy. They get right up into the canopy. You can see the clumps up there. That was taken in a year where we couldn't find many fruit lowdowns. We actually needed the arborist to find fruit for us. That was in 2020. So we've had pretty good success in the last 2 seasons that we've done this. We've kind of done this in 2.5 seasons. We don't really count 2020. It was pretty bad, but the last 2 seasons we've managed to plant about 2,000 seeds up with the canopy. There's the guys up there. This photo is taken by one of the arborists. That's Christy from BirdLife from HBOC, Christy Peters. No. Might be a fisheye lens on the phone. And that photo there is taken up in the canopy. So that's really exciting to see germination happening in the canopy. That's exactly what we're after. So what happens with the mistletoe seeds? About 90% of the seeds will actually take. They will sprout. But then that's the easy part. For the mistletoe plant to then latch onto the branch, that's the really difficult part. So 90% will germinate, but only 10% of that 90 will actually turn out to be a viable plant. So yeah. So good question, Drew. I don't think there is, and this is why this whole mistletoe thing is really exciting, because I don't think there's really any guidelines or all that. It's, there's a few people in Victoria that are doing it, and Peter Vaughan talks about mistletoe fairies. Like, how do these plants? You do see plants around the place, and those rest areas. So we actually, the vast majority of our fruit for these these plantings have come from the 2 Wataka rest areas along the Hunter Expressway. You go there and just walk around, and there's mistletoe everywhere at like chest height. We even rang the RTA and said, "Did you guys plant mistletoes when you planted these spotted gums?" And they said, "No." So Peter's convinced there's a mistletoe fairy out there somewhere. If you do go there when they're fruiting, be kind, because we need a lot of those fruits. Don't pick all of them. Yeah. Well, this is something we want to do, is put cameras on these plants, because mistletoe birds are really easy to work out if they've been around, because as you saw in that video, they squeeze and they get the fruit out, and then it's just the shell that's left. And that empty shell just drops to the ground. So if you see lots of those empty shells on the ground, you know there's been mistletoe birds around. But we're finding like half-chewed clumps, just like sometimes stuck in the branch or on the ground, which we can't work out what's doing that, whether they might be possums or something. So we're going to put some cameras up to see what does that. But Drew, I guess this addresses what you were just saying. Like you can see from that image there, if you plant a seed on a bit of bark that's about to shed, you're wasting your time because the whole thing just drops away. So you know, we've found a few things like avoid junctions and obviously make sure that the bark isn't going to shed. But you know, we're really sort of learning on the job. So yeah, it's just so easy to do because it's so sticky, as you saw in the video. It's literally a matter of squeezing it out, wiping it on the underside of a branch, and that's it. You walk away. There's no digging holes or getting your hands dirty. So what we're hoping to do with some upcoming funding is produce a grow your own mistletoe booklet sort of thing. And so this work was featured recently at the Australasian Ornithological Conference, where Christy from HBOC and BirdLife gave a talk, and she gave a talk with Tara Deva, who's the CEO of Minda River, and it was in the section of the AOC called Indigenous Perspectives. So people that may have seen the video of the captive release where, you know, being welcome to Wanneroo country and all that. So we're working very closely with the Wanneroo people and Minda River Land Council as the landholders, which has just added 5 or 6 layers of meaning to the work we're doing. It's just absolutely incredible to be working with those guys. And of course, there's all these parallels between the bird losing its song and the people losing their language. And we're kind of, at the moment, reawakening both at the same time on this one patch of land. And the mistletoe has half driven a lot of it. And through the same land care funding, BirdLife and Minda River organised a knowledge sharing workshop recently, which was great. We got a bunch of Wanneroo elders out on country with, you know, various stakeholders from the government, a few uni students, land care and others, and it was really great just to sit around and share knowledge. So if you're a muso, you know you've made it if you make it to the cover of Rolling Stone. That's sort of the piece de resistance. But in the bird world, you want to get your mug on the cover of Audubon magazine. So a couple of years ago, we featured in Audubon magazine, and the mistletoe planting was featured in that. Unfortunately, it was that sort of dud year, but really great to have you know, Tara featured and the mistletoe work featured in that magazine, which has a readership of over 1 million. And yeah, we've had articles in the Guardian published, and I think this is so funny that old mate Leo shared our article on his Twitter page. 17 million followers. I thought that's pretty cool. I'm going to write to him. I just haven't gotten around to it. I'm going to get him over. He's going to save heads because nothing else will. So yeah, so just winding up. I've got no idea how long I've been talking for, but I do recommend the Mistletoes of Southern Australia by David Watson. It's fantastic. It doesn't just talk about plants, it talks about all the historical and cultural aspects, and you know, he's got a pizza oven made out of mistletoe. Yeah, and of course the acknowledgements, collaborators and funders. So thanks for listening. Had to get a kissing out of the mistletoe reference in some way. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. We don't know, but we saw the same thing happen in the Capity Valley. In fact, the section of the Capity Valley where David Gearing used to go find all the regents through the 90s, that section of the Capity River, every single mistletoe clump died, every single one. We walked it 5 or 6 times, they all died. And it did happen during the drought. You know, you don't want to always, drought, but when life gets really tough for the host plant, life gets really tough for the mistletoe. So I've often wondered about the ones at Medhurst because I don't know if the drought was as severe there. I don't know, but they don't tolerate the species that live in a coastal catchment anyway. They don't tolerate like prolonged dry very well. But otherwise, I don't know, Bob. No, I didn't, and I don't even know, to be honest. Like they certainly can live for well over 10 years, but maybe a lot longer.
Yeah, if you've seen it's like maybe 4 or 5 years to come to flowering.
Yeah. I mean, I've been going to heads for over 20 years, and I've been seeing the same clumps, you know. So I mean, they could be actually long lived. Yeah. I mean, you do see some truly enormous clumps too. Yeah. Neil?
What range of flora is
Good question. So some mistletoe plants have their own particular hosts. So the needle leaf mistletoe, as an example, it only grows on casuarinas. It doesn't grow on anything else. Whereas the long flowered mistletoe, which is that one that we're planting in Melbourne, out there it grows on spotted gums and narrow-leaved apples and Godfrey bakeri, but it will very happily grow on callistemons. It even grows on silky oaks. Christie's had success planting them on all sorts of even introduced trees. So some mistletoes, they just don't seem to be that fussy. I mean, in a forest environment, they have their own hosts. Like you do not see that mistletoe growing in ironbarks and things like that, but they will grow in other. I mean, I think naturally they would grow in callistemons in the wild, but you know, even just around Shortland, you can see that mistletoe growing in bottle brushes.
It's funny once you start looking for when you travel all over Australia, there's so many different communities that happen. Like David talked quite a bit of ornithology years ago about this, and he taught us up there, and he sort of sparked that interest in this amazing vegetation community, all different ones that have, because they're really cryptic until once you get yourself playing them, and then you start noticing, and you go, oh wow,
that's that's right.
Obviously, lots of maybe the generalists are the ones doing with so much fragmentation. They're the ones that we see more often because they're out in the paddocks and not in the forest.
Most of them grow on wattles. It's fair to say that acacias are the main hosts I mean, let's face it, gum trees kind of thin out in Australia, but there's wattles everywhere. So wattles are, and some mistletoes are actually, their hosts are other mistletoes. So they parasitise mistletoes. They specialise in growing on other mistletoes. And one point that I don't think I made in that talk about the mistletoe birds and coming in, it would have been an even slower process, because what happens with mistletoe birds in particular, not so much other things like orioles and parrots which would travel, mistletoe birds tend to only disperse mistletoe within a small patch. So they basically just are going from tree to tree, but they're kind of spreading mistletoe within a small area. So they're not really dispersing it across a landscape. So that's another reason why it would have taken a very long time for it to come back.
You said that with mistletoe birds, it is very easy to tell when they have been eating mistletoe.
Yeah, by the shell. Yeah.
So how does that compare
Yeah. I painted honeyeaters do the same, so they squeeze it out. Other birds, I don't know, but I would suspect they just gobble the whole lot.
Can't imagine a red-winged parrot doing the other thing.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I was just trying to think what those birds are doing. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, because those birds have normal digestive tracts, they can actually digest the skin.
Yeah.
The reason that the mistletoe bird in particular doesn't take the skin is because it can't digest it. It have a pretty major bellyache because they don't have a gizzard. It's just that seed just goes straight through. So other birds can probably deal with it, but yeah, I don't actually know. Yep.
Do you have any follow-up with what happens with the ones in pine trees in Melbourne?
Yeah, good question. Every now and then I keep thinking, oh, I should see what's going on in Melbourne. No, I don't. But yeah, I'm pretty sure. Well, I know that I have seen online like workshops like Melbourne Council have said mistletoe survey days or something. So they are still monitoring, but I don't actually know the results. Whereas we're in year 3.5 or something, they're only in sort of year 5. Like it's still pretty early days. I don't know if those mistletoes would be functioning as habitat quite yet. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Those mistletoes are creeping mistletoes. They're different to the ones that we use.
How many varieties are there in the hunter?
In the hunter, there's 5 around Cessnock. So at a guess, I'd say a dozen to 15. Yeah, there's 97 in Australia, and there's a lot. There's a lot of inland ones, and there are some that are literally endemic to small areas of the west coast. There's no mistletoe in Tasmania, which is really interesting. And so, so when we think about why mistletoe doesn't take over a forest, the theory is that brush-tailed possums actually are one of the things that keep mistletoe in check. A lot of brush-tailed possums out there, and every night they're out there and they're gobbling the leaves of the mistletoe plants. David Watson speculates that there's so many bloody brush-tailed possums in Tasmania. That's why the mistletoes haven't taken hold there. But because they are in New Zealand, just not in New Zealand. Yeah, so yeah, Jeff, maybe. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. There are. Yeah.
But there's no one in Antarctic beach.
I don't. Yeah. I don't. Yeah. 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 I mean, the painted honeyeater is actually a remnant honeyeater, like striped is another one, that actually evolved from being a rainforest. So when Australia was covered in rainforest, there were all these different honeyeater species that specialised in like Lewins, eating fruit in rainforests. So over time, the painted honeyeater has sort of maintained its fruit eating diet as a honeyeater, but it's gone to a different, yeah. Yeah, good question. I knew someone would ask that. Yeah, oh, geez. David Watson has spoken about that. It's something to do with not being noticed by, like the mistletoe birds have got it sorted sort of thing, and they actually create a mind map of where all the mistletoe clumps are. But they don't. Yeah, they know exactly, and they have a daily routine. Apparently, they go around. They know where the fruits are. They know where every clump is, which is why they're only doing things locally. They're not sort of taking it to another patch of bush. But so I think the theory was that the mistletoe plant needs the mistletoe bird to do this, but it doesn't need other big things like currawongs and just coming in and raiding it. So I think that was the theory. Yeah, that's, yeah. There's all these things, because mistletoe is still fairly new to me. All these things that I keep thinking I've got to work that out, and that's something to my homework. Yeah, I will. Actually, so I'm hoping that in I don't know, 18 months, a couple of years' time, Christy will give us a follow-up talk about the planting project and all that sort of stuff, just as an update. And we'll talk about that then.
There's a couple of chat things. So
Okay.
Questions or
We can't hear you. Is the breeding success cyclical? I'm not sure what.
We can't hear the audience question.
No,
we know
that.
that.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to repeat some of those
Yeah.
questions.
well,
We're going to remix the capture the audience. Yeah, we know.
Sorry, Judy. That's my bad. Yeah, I forgot. I did mean to do that, but I just got carried away with the audience here. You can find those answers on the on the Zoom recording that will come out. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally spoke enough when you haven't heard the question.
Get the context.
Get it, yeah. If you weren't, yeah, they do.
Yeah. Assuming Judy won with the why there is asking about Regent's the breeding success being cyclical. I would say it shouldn't be. It's just the fact that there's so few birds, and the few birds that we do find in time that are nesting, quite often those nests will be predated. All sorts of things predate Regent Honeyeater nests. Like it's a list as long as your arm, and so it's a real challenge. So really, at the end of the day, it's a numbers game. We need to get more Regent Honeyeaters in the landscape. So there isn't just a random pair breeding somewhere where there are sitting duck for kookaburras, ravens, all the nest predators. I mean, what happened in that section of the Merriwar River? That was only a 400-metre section of river, and there were 5 nests. It's like that's what you're really after is them sort of establishing a mini colony, I guess. Enough for me.
Yeah, yeah.